Chapter 7. The Age of Reunion.
The Convergence of Crises. For people immersed in the study of any of the crises that afflict our planet, it becomes abundantly obvious that we are doomed. Politics, finance, energy, education, healthcare, and most importantly the ecosystem are headed toward near certain collapse. During the 10 years I've spent writing this book, I have become familiar with each of these crises of civilization, enough to get some sense of their enormity and inevitability. Every year I would wonder whether this might be the last normal year of our era. I felt the dread of what a collapse might bring, and visited the despair of knowing that our best efforts to avert it are dwarfed by the forces driving us toward catastrophe. One of the main purposes of this book is to speak to that despair. In answer, I offer a plausible and unexpected optimism. It is not a blind optimism that ignores the magnitude of our crisis, but a practical one that sees and integrates all the ugly facts of our world. It is an optimism fully aware of the horror and suffering that are as old as civilization, and that are approaching their feverish crescendo in the convergence of crises that is almost upon us. First and foremost, I am aware of the environmental crisis. Climate change, desertification, coral bleaching, tree death, topsoil erosion, habitat destruction, irreversible loss of biodiversity, toxic and radioactive waste, the PCBs in every living cell, the vast swaths of disappearing rainforests, the dead rivers, lakes, and seas, the slag heaps and quarry pits, the living world reduced to profit and pavement. I am aware of peak oil and the dependency of all aspects of our economic infrastructure and food supply on fossil fuels. And I realize that no conventionally recognized alternative energy source can possibly hope to replace oil and gas anytime soon. I am aware of the impending health crisis, the epidemic rise of autoimmune diseases, the causes and effects of heavy metal poisoning, electromagnetic, chemical, and genetic pollution. I am aware of the degeneration of the modern diet, the toxicity and impotence of most pharmaceutical drugs, the suppression of alternative therapies. I am aware of the fragility of the global financial system, a Ponzi scheme 500 years in the making, and the hyperinflation, currency collapse, and depression waiting for the day when the American debt pyramid can no longer be sustained. I know about the political trend toward fascism and the surveillance state, the barely concealed contingency plans for martial law, the concentration of media, and the ubiquitous propaganda machine, so successful that even its operators are unconscious of it, that legitimizes the hijacking of government for profit in the world's most heavily armed nation. I know of the machinations of the global power elite, its addiction to the arms, narcotics, and prison industries, and its increasing desperation to hold on to power as things fall apart. Nor do I imagine that we can cleanse the system by removing a few bad apples, because I understand that nearly every important institution of our civilization is complicit in this plunder. I am aware that the bloody terror that has long stalked civilization remains essentially undiminished today. My optimism does not ignore the Tutsi babies smashed to death against walls in front of their mothers. It does not ignore the genocide repeated throughout history with no end in sight. Nor am I ignorant of the widespread torture happening in prisons and police stations around the world, including my own country. My optimism is cognizant of the ongoing destruction of the world's languages, cultures, and communities at the hands of the all-consuming global corporate consumer monoculture. I know about the factory working conditions in the Third World and the utter destitution and despair that prevails there. I have met people working 80-hour work weeks, barely subsisting, so that the developed world can suffocate under useless piles of plastic junk that contribute to its own brand of misery. I am aware that even the winners, the most privileged under the present global regime, are actually among its most pitiable victims. I have witnessed the alienation, despair, and loneliness of the very rich, whose acquisition of mansions, money, sports cars, wealth, prestige, and power do nothing to fill the inner void. I am as aware as the most outspoken radical that our schools have become much like prisons, complete in some cases with barbed wire barricades, metal detectors, random locker searches, uniforms, prohibition on personal articles, drug testing, armed guards, undercover police, video surveillance, and chemical control over those who will not submit. I know of parents threatened with legal action for failing to medicate their children. Nor does my optimism depend on the God technology to come to save us, for I am aware that technology has abetted the despoilation of the planet, the acceleration of the pace of life, and the dehumanization of the world as it is converted into money, property, and data. So please do not think that I am an optimist only because I do not recognize the true dimensions of the crisis. I have integrated it all and remain an optimist. The kind of optimism associated with a blithe disregard for the fact that many people today live in hell and are creating more hell is no optimism at all, but mere fantasy. It is a kind of optimism that paves over a toxic waste dump and forgets it was ever anything but a parking lot. Out of sight, out of mind. As the parking lot metaphor suggests, false optimism of this sort is actually a recipe for disaster. My optimism is of a different sort, independent of the logic of the technological fix, which says that these problems swept under the rug don't matter, that science, after all, will find an answer, that technology will find a way. By now, I think most of us see through that, as the long-awaited technological utopia recedes ever further into the future. It is not my purpose to persuade you that we indeed face an environmental, financial, political, energy, soil, medical, or water crisis. Others have done so far more compellingly than I could. Nor is it my aim to inspire you with hope that they may be averted. They cannot be, because the things that must happen to avert them will only happen as their consequence. All present proposals for changing course in time to avert a crash are wildly impractical. My optimism is based on knowing that the definition of practical and possible will soon change as we collectively hit bottom. Another way to put it is that my optimism depends on a miracle. No, not a supernatural agency come to save us. What is a miracle? A miracle comes from a new sense of what is possible, born from a surrender of the attempt to manage and control life. In individual experience, miracles often happen when life overwhelms us. For an alcoholic, to suggest just stop drinking is ludicrous, impossible, unimaginable. It takes a miracle. The changes that need to happen to save the planet are the same. No mainstream politician is proposing them. Few are even aware of just how deep the changes must go. When the above-mentioned crises converge, when we experience acutely and undeniably that the situation is out of control, when the failure of the old regime is utterly transparent, then solutions that appear hopelessly radical today will become matters of common sense. And this will happen. The timing of each crisis is uncertain, but the forces driving them are inexorable and cannot fail to be expressed sooner or later. Processes set in motion long ago have accelerated past critical mass. We are just beginning to taste their effects. Even if we somehow stop making new pollution right now, the cumulative effects of existing ecological damage are enough to generate catastrophe. The same inevitability is true in other realms as well: public health, education, finance, and politics. It is already too late. It is only a matter of how soon, how bad, how long. However bad you think it is probably worse. Read books like The Dying of the Trees or Boiling Point if you don't believe me. Like the Titanic, the momentum of technological society is so huge that even if we reversed the engines and steered hard right now, the short-term and mid-term course of events would not change much. We are on a collision course with nature that can no longer be averted. Yet not only have we done little to break or steer away from the looming iceberg, we have maintained an obvious policy of full speed ahead. In the United States, Republican policy has been essentially, what iceberg? While the Democrats try to change course by a few degrees, but not so quickly as to spill the drinks on the first-class deck. The practical proposals and workable compromises on the table are woefully inadequate. One party repudiates the Kyoto Treaty and the other endorses it, but few acknowledge that even that is far too little, far too late. Outside the United States, quote-unquote developing countries such as India and China, abetted by Western institutions, stoke the Titanic's furnaces with their headlong industrialization, using the old linear model of extraction, processing, consumption, and waste. And meanwhile, on the deck the party continues, as it will continue to continue, even after the first crunch reverberates through the ship. Even as the icy torrent consumes compartment after compartment. On the top deck, the band will play on even as the ship lists and rolls, maintaining a desperate and deadly illusion of normalcy. At this point, the utter bankruptcy of the program of competition, security, and financial independence will begin to become so flagrantly obvious that no one will be able to ignore it. I once read a pessimistic book of the business genre, forecasting a polarized society of crime-ridden slums and wealthy, walled, gated, fenced, alarmed, guarded communities. The author's advice was to contrive to live in the latter. This is tantamount to climbing to the highest deck of a sinking ship. Everyone speaks of the intensifying competitiveness of the present era, evoking in my mind masses of rats struggling and clawing for the top, where they will perish but a few minutes later than the rest. Yes, you can locate yourself as far as possible from the war zones, trash incinerators, toxic waste dumps, smog zones, bad neighborhoods, and other perils of an increasingly toxic world. But sooner or later, the converging crises of our era will obliterate all defenses. No matter how diversified your investments, no matter how many guns in your walled compound or cans of food in your basement, the tide of calamity will eventually engulf you. Gates, locks, razor wire, and guns can ensure security only temporarily, and a fraudulent, anxious security it is. Eventually we will abandon our bunker mentality and understand that the only security comes through giving, opening, and being at the center of a flux of relationships, not taking more and more for self. Security comes not from independence, but from interdependence. The survivors will not be those who try to insulate themselves in a fortress, but who are able to give, to help, and to contribute to a community. They will form the basis of a new kind of civilization. Our crises are converging within a 10 or 20-year time span because they are related. Each helps precipitate the others, even as each arises from the common source described in this book. We can see harbingers of what is to come when politicians use terrorism as a pretext to abrogate civil liberties,